So here we are again. I wasn't quite happy with the first two takes on this video, so this is the third. I hope I'll be able to fit everything in and without any errors this time. Before I start, I'd just like to say the Varg teaser that I posted last, the Neanderthal video I spoke about in the About section there, will be presented soon. But I just want to do some more, do some revision as to the research and see if there are any new studies that are relevant that have popped up since I last presented on this on a page I run. The other thing is the Solutrean hypothesis has been recommended to me as a video by two people, and it's a very interesting theory to me. So that may be the next video I present on the Solutrean hypothesis. This will be the last video where I'm sitting talking at you for the whole video. I will be downloading some video editing software today, and then I'll overlay relevant images at various points in the video, so it'll be a mix of me face-to-face and me presenting images. Right, so this, by way of introduction, as the channel's still fresh and new, and we may have viewers who don't know that much about physical anthropology, this video is going to discuss the 6 major human races. So, first I'll talk a little bit about the archaic admixtures and the routes of migration. So a little bit of this we covered very briefly in the last video. Here it will still be brief because I'll go into detail about each section of this information in later videos. So let me just close that quick. Right, so the first migration, significant migration, is out of Africa. Most of the world's population, even the Negroid population in Africa, descends from people who made that out of Africa journey, since the main Y-DNA group in Negroids is E, and this formed either in Eastern Africa or most likely in Southwest Asia with the out of Africa population. Then the earliest branch of the E lineage went back into Africa, went into West Africa, where it hybridized with an earlier population that was probably of the B Y-DNA group and a little of A perhaps, and would have been high in African archaic hominid, recently nicknamed as the ghost species. So this is the African equivalent of the ancient hominids where it mixed with, in Europe being Neanderthal and Asia being Denisovan. So the pygmids of Central Africa are most similar to this ghost species. They have the highest amount of autosomal admixture of DNA from the same, and they also have a lot of the earlier B haplotype and very little of E, which is the later addition. But the main group of Negroids proper, are quite different in metrics to the pygmids, but the admixture shows. Pygmids are quite short and stocky, they're endomorphic, whereas the Negroid as a whole is ectomorphic. That means it's gracile in frame, it has a light skeletal build. That's why they're such excellent runners, for example. So first we'll talk, I'll finish talking about the Negroid race, then I'll carry on about the other migrations. So comparatively, it has the second smallest skull of all races after Australoids. It has a long and narrow skull, but quite a low vaulted skull. It has the darkest pigmentation, so the pigmentation ranges from quite dark brown to what we call black, and the hair is black and curly, typically. There's a little bit of admixture in North Africa. The homeland of the race, like I say, is in West Africa. From West Africa, the Negroid race spread to the east and to the south. So to the south into Central Africa, where the pygmids still live. In the east, it pushed out the Nilotic race, who are probably a branch of the Capoid race, which I'll come to next, but they've since been admixed with the Negroids, so they are transitional between the two, if you like. and then they moved from East Africa into Southern Africa with the Southern Bantu. And that was in quite recent history, but we'll cover the Bantu migration in another video in full, because it's very interesting. It's essential for understanding African history for the most part. Then we have the Capoid race. The Capoid race is also ectomorphic, but in comparison, they have very long torsos, when Negroids have very short torsos. So long torsos were historically a Caucasoid trait. Caucasoids have various different body types. They have the widest range. It's also a trait of Americoids. There's long torsos. And that's possibly because of different ancestral admixtures. It's possibly also partially as a process of adaptation for desert life, because they were pushed into the far southwest of Africa, lots of which is desert, by the expansion of the Negroid race. Now, the Capoid race has caramel skin, so much lighter than the Negroid. It has transitional features in terms of its craniometrics. It's higher vaulted, relatively speaking. I think it may have a slightly larger overall skull, especially in relation to the body, because the body is not so large. It also has a long and narrow skull. It has, so as I said, it has some transitional features, some Caucasoid features in its skull when compared to Negroids, and it has lidded eyelids, which are Mongoloid feature. It can be seen or said to be the earliest race, the Adamic race, the race that split off of man that split off first. It's relatively rare in its unmixed type. It's only the San population. The Khoi, historically from the Khoikhoi, the Khoi part of the Khoisan population already have limited Negroid admixture. They are essentially Capoid, at least most groups. As one moves east, some of the groups look more phenotypically Negroid. The A Y-DNA haplotype is what's largely carried by Capoids and is also very high in most Nilotic peoples. So it's probable that the A paternity dominated all the way from East Africa to Southern Africa before the Bantu expansion, which again we'll get back to at some point. Right, so we finished talking about those. It's also worth noting the Negroid race has the highest hormones of any race. And it's followed by Caucasoids, second highest, which we'll move on to next. Caucasoids have a huge variation in body type and in craniometric type. In skull size, alongside the Amerindians, the Americoids, they are second in skull size only to the Mongoloids. But as I said, it varies a lot. They range historically from hyperdolichocephalic, which means very long-skulled, and now most Caucasoids outside Europe are dolichocephalic, which is long-skulled, and in Europe the majority are mesocephalic, which is medium-skulled. In the southwest of Europe and in parts of the Levant, that is the north of the Middle East, they are brachycephalic, which is short-skulled. So Europeans, in terms of pigmentation, are the lightest. They range from pale and rosy to olive-skinned in Europe, and outside of Europe, more brown in North Africa and in South Asia, which can be due to Negroid and Australoid admixtures. But it's worth mentioning that the Socotrans seem to be a proto-Caucasoid population, and the Socotrans are also dark-skinned, and it doesn't seem to be due to any admixture, so it may simply be an ancestral trait that was retained in their population but transitioned in other populations. Now, it's also worth mentioning that we have the most defining traits that are directly defined from Neanderthal. So in Europe, a large part of the immune system, the functional parts, genes regarding the immune system, and the genes regarding the pigmentation and texture of hair and skin are directly derived from Neanderthal. But we'll come into whether Asians or Europeans have more Neanderthal later. Asians do have a hair texture gene. The gene that gives them their very straight hair comes from Neanderthal directly. but other than that, there don't seem to be many functional genes that they inherited from the same. Right, so Americoids, the Amerindians, they're transitional between the Caucasoids and the Mongoloids. They had historically been listed as part of the Mongoloid race, but it's not the case. Genetically and phenotypically, they're in between the two. A lot of the groups tend towards mesocephaly rather than brachycephaly, so medium rather than short skulls, which again is more Caucasoid trait than Mongoloid trait, and they have even more Neanderthal inheritance than Europeans, and I don't think they have very much, if any, Denisovan. Any Denisovan they do have is due to their minor admixture with Mongoloids as they moved east to found the populations of the Americas. The Americoids, as I mentioned, also have long torsos. They have mesomorphic build, so their skeletal structure is in between the robust and the gracile. And then we move on to Mongoloids. Mongoloids tend towards endomorphy, because they're quite short and stubby in stature, if we can say it like that. They have minor Denisovan admixture. Denisovan admixture is at its peak at over 10% in the Australoids, in Australian Aboriginals, for example. Mongoloids have the largest skulls of any race, whereas Australoids have the smallest skulls of any race. So their ancestral populations both mixed with Denisovans, but because of very separate evolutionary paths, the Australoids going south to the tropics, and the Mongoloids staying relatively north, they diverged quite a lot. And yeah, the Australoids have very shallow but long skulls. They're of moderate width. The Mongoloids have very wide skulls, fairly high skulls, and as I said, largest overall skulls, even though they're quite short, relatively speaking. Very short relative to the Dolichocephalic races. So then, what else do we have to cover? Okay, hormones. Mongoloids have the lowest hormones, and they also don't actively sweat, so they give off pheromones at a much lesser rate than other mammals and than other humans in general. For both reasons, I think that more or less covers it. I got it done a little bit quicker than the limit I set for myself. If there's anything more you'd like to know about any of the races in particular, I mean, as I say, I will go into sub-races of each of them at one point, so I'll do a more in-depth video on each of the 6 covered in this video, and I'll try to provide studies and maps and things that are relevant as soon as I have this editing software downloaded. So thanks for watching again. Please sub and share, help us build the channel to the point where we can provide you with more and better info, and again, just shout any videos you'd like to see other than a couple I've already mentioned I'll be doing soon. Thank you very much.